Well, hello. Welcome to week 2, session 3 of my AAA character topology workshop. During the course of today's stream, I'm going to be talking about facial topology mostly. I'll be looping back around to the retopology that I was working on last week, the sort of scary wolfman guy. But today, I'm mostly going to be focused on the type of topology and the type of structures that you would be seeing in a AAA game that uses, say, face scans or very high resolution models that generally have things like performance capture and other pretty advanced animation stuff going on for things like facial expressions and lots of morph maps, blend shapes, that type of thing. I'm going to be talking about best practices for laying out facial topology for that type of thing. And then I'm going to actually jump in and start making some retopology. Excuse me. Over the course of these next 2 or so hours, I'm going to be taking questions in the Twitch chat as people start to stream in. No pun intended. And then after the stream ends at 9 p.m. Pacific time, I'm going to be going into the private Google Hangout with the people who signed up for the workshop to do things like critiques, feedback, talking about specific things that I did on the stream, sort of doing group discussion, that type of thing. During the next one of these streams, I'm going to be talking more about facial topology. I'm going to be finishing off some of the topology for one of the heads I'm going to be working on tonight. And I'm going to be sort of attaching, I'm going to be doing some retopology for the head of that werewolf guy that you saw last week, and attaching that to the rest of his body. And then over the course of next week, I'll be talking about hand topology, because hand topology is a pretty big subject, especially for AAA games where you have lots of hand movement, lots of motion capture, and lots of animation. Hands are one of those areas, kind of like faces, that show a lot of expression, so it's important to be able to capture that with the right type of topology, the right type of UVs, etc. And then after that, I'll be talking about UVs, hair cards, hard surface for characters, that type of thing in the final week of this workshop. So if you're interested, this is going to be every Tuesday and Thursday at this same time, 7 p.m. Pacific time. And then later on, I'll be talking about other workshops I'm planning on doing in the future. So cool, let's get started. So here I have a head scan, which you may have seen in a few places online if you've been paying attention to places like ArtStation or that type of thing. This is a head scan that was done quite a while ago, and lots of people use it for things like skin shader testing, VR applications, basic modeling examples and workflows, that type of thing. You see it in a lot of rendering examples. I find it very useful for what we're doing tonight because it has very good examples of areas where we're going to want to concentrate detail in 2 ways when we go about retopologizing. Because the scan of this older gentleman has a lot of interesting shapes and deep creases and wrinkles along with strong cheekbones and that type of thing, it serves to kind of accentuate what I'm going to be talking about tonight, which is specifically how facial topology should generally be laid out on a model that is planned to be used for things like performance capture, or performance capture driven animation in a game, rather. So, with that in mind, let's talk about some topology and talk about some of the most basic elements of facial topology, and then start getting into the sort of nitty-gritty and actually start retopologizing. Now, the head that I'm going to be retopologizing is not this one, since this one is very asymmetrical. You can see from the front view that the ears don't line up exactly. His face is sort of at an angle. His eyes don't match exactly. One is higher than the other. You know, just a bunch of little things that make it difficult to do retopology, because retopology benefits from having symmetry. So instead, I'm going to be using a different head scan. Another one that you might have also seen. This is the good old Infinite Realities head scan. This one is significantly more symmetrical, and there's actually some stuff that I'm going to do to make it completely symmetrical, just so that it'll be easier to work on and lay down some base topology on. But we'll get to that in just a little bit. So back to this guy. Let's talk about basic facial topology and sort of what it entails. Now, in general, most people know that facial topology has things. Well, if you've been around 3D modeling for a while, especially character modeling, you'll know that in general, faces have edge loops that circle around the most important parts of the face. However, the layout of those edge loops can change depending upon how the character looks, or any number of factors. The key thing that I'm going to be focusing on tonight is laying out topology that could work for this face, that could work for this face, that could even work for, say, Nathan Drake in Uncharted, or a character in Spider-Man, like I have going at work. We're going to be laying out some very generic topology that can be deformed to fit any number of different faces, whether they're symmetrical or not. And in doing that, we need to keep several different things in mind. Specifically, we need to keep in mind that basically every character is going to have, for the most part, the same types of facial structures. Now, obviously, this will change if you're working on a very stylized game or something, but in general, what you'll see is a character will have a nose, some eyes, a mouth, and an ear. Well, some ears, hopefully. Additionally, these characters will have certain features around and between those main landmarks which need support by way of topology. So let's talk about some of those features. One of the most important features, secondary features aside from the eyes, nose, and mouth, is the nasolabial fold, which on this guy comes right here. Now, why is this important to note? Well, a few reasons. One, the nasolabial fold is one of the areas of the face that, when you're looking at performance capture or just general animation, deforms the most. Specifically, you'll see that this area moves up the face, and let's just do this, and then this area, along with some of this area, deforms and scrunches up and gets more rounded around here. Because it's being moved in this direction, the only thing it can do is sort of bunch up, similarly to how, say, well, a piece of meat on a cutting board would sort of bunch up as you push it across the cutting board. There's friction, there's the idea that it's attached to the underlying bones and surfaces underneath the skin, so it doesn't have anywhere to go except to either bunch up or move in this direction. So we need to support that type of motion by having edge loops that go around the nasolabial fold, through the middle of the cheek, and connecting to just under the eye. Now, these are going to be bulging out. Here, and I can do a quick illustration of how this might sort of look. They'll be bunching up sort of like this. However, we also have motion that goes perpendicular to this motion. We have, and we need support that goes perpendicular to this motion. So we in addition to having the movement in that direction, we have that outward motion, so we need something to support that outward motion like this. So what we'll do is we'll also lay out lines that go like this, radiating out from the loop of the nasolabial fold. Now, what this gives us is a very basic structure that looks like this. This is going to move around in some very specific ways, and the topology is built to support it. It's also a very simple topology that's easy to lay out. And I'm going to be laying out some of this topology as this stream continues. But for now, we're just going to be talking about the general layout and why it's laid out that way. So in addition to having, say, the nasolabial fold and the cheeks, we also need enough we need enough geometry for deformation in other areas. Now, what other areas move a lot? Those are the areas that we're going to need to have more geometry. Additionally, the areas that move a lot tend to have lots of small detail, so those are also areas where we're going to want to have tighter geometry so that we can sculpt those areas more easily. So what are these other areas? Well, obviously the mouth is going to be moving a lot. The eyes are going to be blinking and looking around. And the forehead is going to be sort of sliding up and down as we the forehead is going to be sliding up and down like this and like this as he emotes, as he makes facial expressions and, you know, raises his eyebrows or scrunches them to show that he dislikes something, that type of thing. So naturally we're going to want to pack some more detail in here, around the eyes, and around the mouth. Now, what other areas, aside from the nasolabial fold, should we be concerned with? Clearly we need some loops going through here. We don't have a ton of room, so we're going to connect this loop right there. And so, yeah, what other areas are going to be moving a lot? Well, the tip of the chin does not move an incredible amount. It moves generally along with the bottom lip, but mostly with the entire jaw. However, there are some areas, like this fold right here, where you can see that when he makes some expressions, that area creases together, sort of like the nasolabial fold. So we'll want some support geometry through there. And when he makes expressions, especially ones where he is very stressed, you're going to see that the tendons in his neck will bulge out a little bit and show some stress. And now you can see that this guy has some pretty strong wrinkles going through here, so we're going to want some detail to support that. So what does this leave us with? What this leaves us with is very consistent loops around all the main features that let's just undo that. That will allow us to concentrate detail in those areas. And how we bridge all those areas that we're surrounding with detail determines the geometry of the rest of the face. So let's lay out some basic topology on this guy's face just by painting on it, and then we can start actually laying out geometry on the other face that we have. So we have these basic shapes. We're probably going to want this guy to be fairly symmetrical, so let's just put a line down the center, like this. This just shows the center line of his face, and you can actually see how asymmetrical he is, especially from this angle. That'll be good enough. It's just going to go down the center line. We're really going to lay out the geometry lines for this side of his face, just because it's a little faster and easier that way. So, what do we have here? We have lots of detail up on his forehead, around his mouth, on his cheeks, and around his eyes. Now, his eyes are going to open and close, and they're going to have the edges of the eyelids. So we're going to want some support geometry around the edges of the eyelid just to delineate that. Let's just move this over a little more so that we have some room to work. Now, here's another area where you're going to get some scrunching. So let's put some cuts in there. And let's start bridging things with perpendicular lines to show how things are going to connect with polygons. There's some lines right there. Some lines going across here. Now we had those lines radiating out across his nasolabial fold and mouth before. Let's add those in. We can connect that right there. This right here is going to be an area where several loops come together. There's the loop of the eye, the loop coming around like this, and a loop actually coming down right here. We're going to run into some more areas around his eye where we want to put some more detail. So let's just do that. Let's just close off this loop. There we go. Got that nice perpendicular support loops. So these loops up here are going to allow the forehead to slide around a lot, which will be nice for extreme expressions. He's going to have a line coming out right here so that this loop can connect to his ear or the back of his head. So we'll just have that shoot out back there. This can come down. This can come down. This is going to loop around his chin. This is going to come around the bottom. He's going to have some more detail radiating out here, and this is going to come down his neck. He's going to have a loop coming out right here, and this one can either go down or around back, and that's probably a little cleaner. This one is probably going to connect down here, and depending upon how you want to lay out the ear, it could either connect to the ear like this, or it could connect like that. It sort of just depends on your personal preference, because this area is not an area that's going to receive a lot of deformation aside from some jaw movement in this direction or this direction. So we don't really need to worry about this area as much. But let's get back to around the mouth. We need some more loops around the mouth to support how much the corners of his mouth are going to be moving around. So we'll put another loop in here. We'll have it go underneath the nose. We can have this come along right here. These are going to connect down here to the mouth. And these are going to radiate out like this. And with this loop right here coming back in this direction, it's going to be easy to connect that along the center line of the back of his head to the other side. Meanwhile, you can have a loop coming around like here and here. This can go down that way. And you might want one coming up here, either to connect to this line or to go around farther. Let's have it connect like this though. Oops. Actually, let's have it connect this way. Or you know what? Let's have it connect this way. This is going to be good. This will allow a little more movement to the bottom of his head, and we can terminate right here, or we can terminate in any number of other ways. For example, we could go through here. Because this general area is not going to have a lot of deformation compared to the mouth, we don't need to worry about the specific layout there as much. It's still going to be important that you keep it clean, but it's not going to be as critical as the areas around the eye and the mouth. So we'll get that going up like that. These can connect down here or go that way, either way. But there we have the general layout for some very basic topology on the head. Now, one area that's going to receive some deformation but not a ton is the nostril. You're going to want some sort of loop going through there to support the loop of, or the fold of the nostril. And you're probably going to want some support loops coming down like this. Additionally, you'll want something that comes around this way. And you can actually connect that right there. This connects here. This can connect there. This like this. We can connect that there. If you have another loop up here, you can have it come down that way and go in. And we can sort of build the nose in this way. Pretty quick and pretty simple. And there are a couple different ways to build this nose geometry, and I'm going to get into the one that they use for Uncharted. It's a pretty easy to lay out design, and it's also good for deformation because it allows you to flare the nostrils. So now that we have a good idea of how and why these are laid out the way they are, let's actually get started on really laying stuff out, really getting into the nitty-gritty of how we can do this quickly and easily and efficiently so that we don't have to worry about the layout repeatedly in the future. So let's come back here and just start doing some quick retopology. Let me just move some windows on my other screen just that I have everything set up the way it needs to be. There we go. One moment. All right. So let's lay out some basic topology on this guy and use the same method that I used for laying out the arms and legs and general body shape of the werewolf character that I've been working on. So I'm going to start with the most basic shapes possible and then start adding more and more complexity. But first, to make this guy easier to work on, let's make him completely symmetrical. I'm just going to do that, if it will let me. Here we go. Okay. Let's turn on some wireframes and let's just split him along the center. Delete that half. Resize this. And then mirror him. So it's not going to be perfect. There's some areas that are not as dense as others because he's not 100% symmetrical, but that's okay. All I need is something that's easy to work with. So let's get started retopologizing this guy. Let's just call this one retopo. This one high, just so we know which is which. Let's go to here and start laying out some basic geometry. So we know how these loops are supposed to be laid out. We know that there is literally a circle around the mouth and a circle around the eyes. So let's get started on that first. And just like with the werewolf that I was working on last time, let's do it like this. In this case, I'm going to start with an oval that just has 8 sides. I'm going to put some of those sides at the corners of his eyes just so that I can anchor some stuff there. let's just move these into a nice position so that they work well with his eye shape. Do the same thing with his mouth, except in this case we'll turn on symmetry. Let's merge these. Alright, that's all merged. Let's just join that so it's one big shape. We can mirror this. Okay. Good, good. Now we have something nice and solid to work from. We can start extruding shapes from here. So let's turn symmetry back on and start extruding shapes just like we did with the werewolf character that I have. So how are we actually going to do this? It's simple. First, we're going to do some work to lay out loops around his eyes and mouth. And to do that, we just drag out from here, make sure that they're nicely aligned with the corners of his eyes and the corners of his mouth. Now, in the end, I'm not going to actually have 8 or 16 or 32 sides for his mouth and his eyes. However, this is a nice solid starting point because it gives me the corners and some nice center lines along with midpoints that are just easy to anchor to. So this is going to come out, and this right here is going to be the start of the loop that you see coming out of the corner of his eye. And by that same token, this right here will be this one coming from the other corner and across the bridge of his nose. Now I'm going to rearrange these a little bit as I keep going, and I'm going to be adding more loops and adjusting things. But essentially what I'm going to be doing later on is mimicking the layout that Uncharted uses for their topology, which coincidentally is also almost identical to the topology that we use working on Spider-Man. It's a pretty common layout, and it minimizes the the problems with, say, five-sided poles like you see right here. So here we have the basic loops around his eyes. We're going to do the same thing with his mouth. Join that real quick. Join that. The symmetry isn't quite perfect, so we'll just adjust that. Mirror it. Weld those. Put them in the center. Make sure that everything is nice and welded. Okay. So, right here, this is going to be the loop coming out of the corner of his mouth, which will eventually connect to back here. This is eventually going to connect to his eye. This will go up his nose, and these will go down his chin, and then down his neck onto his chest. And once again, the symmetry is not 100% perfect, but that's okay, because we can just delete it and restart. Okay, so let's move this in as far as we can to just make sure that we have as much detail as possible in here. And let's start sort of mimicking what they have in Uncharted. So in Uncharted they have a loop that comes from the center of the eye right here down to right around here on the, near the corner of his mouth. So let's add some loops right here and right here to sort of mimic that. We'll bridge this, and by bridging this we're also creating the loop for the nasolabial fold. So right here that serves as the start for this loop. Let's get a better color for this so it's a little more visible. Let's just get a nice sort of teal color. There we go. So what we just made right here serves as the start for these loops in this area. And then we're going to be extruding from those loops around the corners of his mouth as well. So let's make sure that we have everything nice and connected. We have another loop coming right here. And what this is going to do right here is allow us to easily drop in the nasolabial fold, like so. We can adjust things so this goes around the contour of his nose. And there's going to be a few cuts between, say, at the top of his lip right here and the bottom of his eye right here, because what we want to do is be able to come up across the bridge of his nose and add detail that connects like this. But first, let's start building the nose, because that's an important area that I sort of skipped over. And to build the nose, we're going to start by moving this loop up to the top of the nasolabial fold, which would be right along here on that positive curve. Here, let's just let's clear this off a little bit so that we can do this a little easier. So we're going to have a loop coming across this part of the nasolabial fold, the center of it, and then below it. So what that's going to do is put this loop along the middle, allowing us to get good sculpting detail in there and have it follow the crease as it moves up when he smiles. The loop that comes up across this positive curve is also going to come up across the top of the nose and connect like this. Then it's going to loop around the chin and connect everything very nicely. So let's do that. Let's start building that. So here, right here, is the positive curve, and then here is the crease of the nasolabial fold. And you can see this guy has much more of a baby face, but you can still see a little bit of that positive curve right in this area. Now we need some detail to extend into the nostril right here. So there's two things we're going to do. We're going to add another loop right here, right about there. What that's going to do is it's going to connect to the top middle of the nostril and allow us to extrude down and down and down until we can get to the inside of his nose. Additionally, we're going to have the loop going right here, which connects to this area at the bottom of his nostril. So let's start doing that. Let's start building that nostril. So we don't have enough detail yet. Let's add that additional loop. Have it come up to the right place, outlining the fold around the nose. Let's have this come down. Okay, that's looking pretty good. And we need to have some sort of support structure for the interior of the nostril. Let's just get rid of that so it's out of the way. So we're actually going to extrude into the nostril right now, like so. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to build a loop that comes around his nose like this. But first, let's get up in there just so that we have some nice support structure so that we can extrude out in all directions. So you can see there's this area right here which doesn't really have much for us at the moment, but if we extrude out like this, add another loop here. Maybe like that. I don't know why I've been using the loop slice when I have the add loop tool right there. But there we go. So we can add this support structure so that what this is going to do is allow us to connect the top lip area to the bottom of the nose. So let's continue this loop like this, connect it to there. And now this is a little bit too wide to get much good detail in the interior of the nose. So we're probably going to want to add an additional loop in here going across all these. So let's do that. Let's just add it right about there and put it down into that crease at the bottom of the nostril. Let's start extruding out so that we start building the interior of the nostril as well. This right here can go in one of two ways. It can go either across the nose like this, and we can continue to extrude like that, or it can go up like this. The difference is negligible, and really you can add detail in much the same way to either one. Here, I can actually show how to do that right now. So if I add, if I add a polygon like this right here, what this will allow me to do let me just make sure I don't have any extra there. Okay. Oh, sorry about that. What this will allow me to do is either extrude along like this and then add more detail in there, or I can do it this way, extrude along here, and add more detail that way. It doesn't really matter too much which layout you go with. I'm going to go with this one right now because it'll be easy for me to make this along here one continuous loop. So I'll just do it this way. So let's connect that so it's in the interior of the nose. Let's get a little bit of detail right here so we can round off the shape of the nose. Right there. And we do need to be able to come down onto the bottom of the nose, so we add some detail right here. Center all of these along the x-axis, just so we can mirror later. We can extrude this forward. Okay. And then this can extrude like this. And then come around and connect to there. Now we have a complete loop that goes around the nostril, allowing us to deform the nostril when the nostril flares. And we have some nice interior structure that will allow us to close it off, making sure that there are no weird gaps. And if you really are stuck on the idea of doing, say, 8 sides for everything, you can just add another loop in here, and it's easy peasy. Now I do have a complication up here. I have some detail in this area that doesn't quite match up. I have too many polygons down here. So one thing that I can do is adjust the direction that these go so that I have fewer loops. And to do that, I can just pull this up here or adjust some of the loop placement. So I'm just going to work on that for a second, and then we can get started connecting the eyes and the chin and such. So let's just do this real quick. So now I have some nice basic topology laid out for that nose. However, there is something that may present complications for rigging and animating the nostrils later on. Now this is a pretty okay layout, especially, and it'll be especially easy to work with this loop right here. However, depending upon the rigging solution that you use and the animation solution that is in use, you may want to actually change the way that these polygons right here along the outside of the nostril are laid out. Specifically, you might actually want to be able to add some additional detail in this area so that when the nostril flares, you'll be able to move this around and not lose any sort of geometric or sculptural detail, or textural detail rather. So one way that you can do that is by changing the way that this loop runs. You can change it so that instead of having it be a continuous loop this way, you can have it be a continuous loop going across the front of the nose and the bottom of the nose down here. And you'll want to talk to whoever is rigging and animating this model to confirm the best way to do that. So in this case, I'm going to once again just kind of copy what copy a lot of what they do in Uncharted, which is to make the layout of these polygons slightly different. So let's do that. If we can pull this back here, have a loop going down, oops, a loop going down like this, and then have this loop come around here and then onto the inside of the nose, connecting right here. This will also allow us to simplify some of this geometry a little bit by having, well, just less of it. While that may not lend itself necessarily to some sculpting, it might just make it easier in the long run to have fewer polygons in there to worry about. And if you look at this as it subdivides, you can see that it adds additional detail in here. There are some more loops, and they're nice and continuous with those edge loops going around the outside of the mouth. So two different ways to do the same thing. This way might be a little better depending upon what your specific needs are, so definitely talk to your rigging team if you have one, or make sure to talk with whoever is doing, say, the performance capture or any other third parties or vendors that you might be working with, because each one will have slightly different ways of working, and sometimes a scan that you work with might have different topology from the final geometry of the model you'll be working with in-game. Well, now that we have a nose, our nose is kind of sorted out right now, let's go back to talking about connecting the mouth to the eyes, and then bridging all of that along the forehead and connecting it to the neck. So the first step for this is making sure that we have consistent detail going into consistent levels of detail going into the eyes and the mouth, since those are the areas that people are going to focus on most. So basically what that'll boil down to is you wanting to have consistent, generally square polygons everywhere. And with that, you'll be wanting to add or remove loops in certain places. In my case, I'm going to be wanting to add a lot more just to keep things nice and even. Additionally, to make sure that this nose connects well to the eye in this area and is able to bridge across the brow, there are a couple of areas where I'll want to add more loops and just keep things a little more consistent. So right along the middle of the nose right here, this is an area where I'll want to add another loop so that I can have, say, sculpted pores, bumps. I can do things like polypaint, and it'll also allow for a bit of scrunching when the character moves by sneering or just scrunching their nose like that. So let's add some more loops in here to connect the bridge of the nose to the eye loop. And let's add another loop to the middle of the nose to get that detail we were just talking about. This is going to make sure that when you subdivide, it's going to be nice and even. And now we can start bridging across the nose like this. Having a loop go from the eye across the bridge of the nose will also make it so that it's easier for this area, which does tend to move a lot, to deform in lots of different ways, whether it's scrunching in when the person kind of scrunches their eyes closed, or moving up like this when they sneer, like I mentioned before. Okay, so we have this going across the bridge of the nose. Let's come up and start bridging the loops of the eye, and let's actually let's adjust this a little bit and add one more loop around the eye to show where we're going to be adding lots more detail later on. Yeah. Oopsie daisy. So we want a lot of detail around the eyes because, one, they're going to be deforming a lot, and two, you're going to be wanting to get a lot of nice detail in there when you sculpt the high poly for this. Now, as you can see on this guy, he's got a lot of detail around his eyes. He's got tons of small wrinkles, crow's feet, this type of stuff that radiates out. He's got, eyebrows. He's got these deep crevices in here. So you'll want to be able to capture that detail. So you'll want to add extra detail to the eye. Additionally, having more detail around the eye makes it easier for areas like crow's feet, the eyebrow right up here where he's going to be pulling in that direction, and the eyelid itself to rotate up into the skull, or to slide along in the directions that these things generally slide along because of the locations and directions of muscle tension. So we'll make sure to add lots of detail around the eyes. Let's just even out the placement of some of these vertices. Now, because we're also going to be sculpting lots of detail around the mouth, we're going to be adding a lot more loops across these, but we're also going to be adding more loops along here. So here's just a nice base to work from, but we're going to be adding more later on. Those are going to do a couple of things for us. One, they're going to give us the ability to, add more, say, detailed nasolabial folds, like you can see in this area, but it'll also allow us to come along the contour of the lips, or add a more detailed philtrum, add frown lines. There's lots of stuff that we can do by just adding additional loops or cuts to this area. But let's start moving up the forehead into places where we know that we're going to have lots of stuff sliding around. It looks like we want to move that just a little bit to even things out. That's going to move up a bit like that. Let's actually extend this up. Let's delete that and add some more detail that will go right into the corner of his eye right here, where you see a lot of, well, it's harder to see on this guy right now because he's a little bit low res, but in this area you do have things like tear ducts, and it's important to have detail for there as well. So let's add a little bit more detail in that area by having another loop. So this is going to feed into this tear duct area right here and allow us to outline things very nicely. We could actually do some fun things with geometry that's not just continuous loops in this area if we wanted to really outline the shape of the tear duct I could do something like this, and then I could bevel it so it sticks out a bit. It really depends, once again, on what the person rigging and animating this wants to do. But that can provide some nice detail in there if you don't have separate meshes for the tear duct and other details in that area. Alright, so now that we have this detail added in here, let's make sure that it's connected across the bridge of his nose in a very even way. We're probably going to move these down just a little bit. And you notice that I have a continuous loop right here. That's going to be easier for people to rig and animate. Let's move this so that it comes across his brow ridge. Move this so we have slightly more even topology. And now, from here, what we can do is we can actually extrude upwards and start to get some nice detail in his forehead. So let's do this. There we go. So now we're starting to build his forehead, and these loops are actually going to be extended across here, going to the back of his head, to the sides of his head. Loops coming from here are going to come back across his cheek and connect to his ear. And loops down here are going to further connect to his mouth, along with go down around his chin. So let's just focus on the forehead right now. And let's have the corner of his eye right here down like that, so that we can have a loop going through here that will connect in a loop around the back of his head. Just center that. Add some detail, and all of a sudden you have a nice basis for the rest of his head. What this means is that I can add some more geometry here. Here, we'll just do it like this. Oops. Like that, like that. Now we can start extending loops out like this. You can even do it this way. This can come back like this. Center that. And depending upon how dense you want things to be, you can have a different number of loops here, and you could also connect them in different ways. For example, you might want to have a little more detail up here, just for the very top, up by his hairline. So you could have some more loops up there, and then connect them in various ways, like so. You can connect that to there, that to there, that go back there, and then loop, oops, and then loop back around. Now once again, this right here is not an area that's going to be deforming a lot, and in a lot of cases it's going to be hidden by hair or a hat, so you might not even have to worry about that. And when you subdivide it, it's fairly clean and gives a pretty nice shape. Alternately, you could connect it like this, and just move this up. And then as you subdivide, it's pretty clean. So I have a question in the chat. Is that something you'd put into a stylized character, the tear duct? It really depends on the style that you're going for. I like to model out as much as I can to add some sort of verisimilitude to the characters that I make, especially stylized characters. You'll notice when looking at my portfolio that I have a lot of stylized characters in there, and even if they don't have the full tear duct modeled out, they do have at least the general shape in that area to outline the shape of the eye. Because I can just give a quick example just by drawing on this guy. We'll just draw it on the back of his head. It doesn't really matter. Here, let's just do it this way. We can use him as a nice canvas. So eyes are not just this sort of almond shape with, this round thing in the center. This is not an actual eye shape. This is a weird stylized eye shape, which doesn't really reflect reality. Instead, eyes have a lot more subtle shapes to them, and those shapes change depending upon your ethnicity, general facial shape, your weight, any number of other things. But one of the key aspects of eyes is that they're not just that sort of weird scallop or almond shape. They do have a bit of that shape, but they can be represented in a much more subtle way by adding things like the shape of the tear duct, and also the part of the eye that comes up right here has part of the tear duct in it. So you have the caruncle right here, and then various little pores and other things coming along here. Got this type of shape, this type of thing going on. This is very, very rough, and this varies from person to person, obviously, but the general shape of an eye is a lot more something like you'd see along these lines. And then to stylize it even farther, I might make the iris small or large. I might remove the little caruncle right here and just have the shape of the eye follow that general contour, just so that it adds a slight bit of verisimilitude to something that is otherwise very stylized. Because having those small details makes it feel more believable, even if it isn't actually more realistic. And believability and realism are not at all the same thing, and they can be very, very far divorced from each other. That's actually where you run into things like the uncanny valley. The idea that something super, super realistic is unsettling often happens because people don't see the things that they expect to see, as opposed to the way that things technically are supposed to be. So by adding small details like that, I will add tear ducts, or at least the general shape of a tear duct, so that the eyes feel more natural and lifelike, even if they're still very cartoony. With bright white irises and very saturated, or bright white scleras and very saturated irises. So there's lots of stuff that you can do with the general shape of an eye to push it in a more stylized or less stylized direction, just depending upon the art direction you're given and any number of other factors. But personal preference, yes, I like to put the tear duct. So we've got some stuff going on right here that's pretty okay. We could sort of change the way that these are connected, as I mentioned before. Change the layout, change the number of loops, and I'm actually going to add just a couple more loops crosswise to his eyes, just to add more detail, make it a little easier to follow the brow ridge up here. And then I'm going to start working my way down the face to his chin and how his mouth connects to his eye, which connects to the chin, which connects to the neck, etc. So let's get started on that. Let's take a look at how this is subdividing. That's pretty okay. All right. So let's see here. What do we got? So we need some loops that go all the way around his mouth. But we also need some loops that connect to his eye. So let's connect his eye and his mouth first. like this. We'll just bridge it like so. And then start pulling some stuff down. Now, the corner of his mouth, it generally helps to have the corner of his mouth either connected to his eye right here or connected to the brow ridge, just depending upon the layout that your rigging team might want. So let's actually connect it to the brow ridge to match, say, some references that I have. I have a few references of models that use facial capture. So let's just copy some of their topology. I mean, that works. I mean, no, you can't really copyright topology because it's just general shapes. So let's do that. Let's just let's add a loop right here to connect his mouth to his eye, right here, right here. And then let's have the corner of his mouth, which extends out along this loop right here, and have it come up and connect right here. So let's connect these. And let's connect these. Smooth this out a bit, have this be a little more even in case we need to sculpt things like crow's feet, like we saw on our other scan. Okay. Let's even some things out a little more. And let's have the loop that goes from his nose wrap around his chin. That's going to give us nice control and the ability to, when he opens his mouth, have the area right here down at the corner stretch back in this direction by having a complete loop going around that way. You can actually see where the loop would go because he's got this very convenient crease right here. So that's going to be like this, and like this, and then this one is going to come around like that. It's going to be great! So let's do that right now. So let's just pull these in just a touch, round them out. And we don't have too much geometry on his lower lip right now, so we can just add a few more loops. Let's add one. No, not right there. Let's add a loop right here so that we can round out the bottom of his mouth. And let's see, this loop, yeah, we'll have that connect around to the bottom. So we'll just extend it out like this, just so we can get the general placement. There's the bottom of his chin, right along there. So now we can see that we need 1, 2, 3, but we only have 2. So we'll just add a loop right there. Move this. We also need 1, 2, but we only have 1 over here, so we'll just add another loop right there. And this is looking pretty sparse in here, so what we'll want to do after we connect this to this or this to this is to add some more loops across these. So let's bridge these. Make sure that everything's nice and even. Right here is the corner of his mouth. Let's make a little bit more room for another loop. Let's start adding some loops. There's one. It's going to be nice
nice and round. And what that's going to do, this connects along here. This one, this is going to connect there, yeah. Let's add, oops, loop right here. What this additional loop, and actually I'll add one more. What these additional loops are going to do is allow us to have more detail as we extrude these down along the neck. And this one is going to have more detail for the bottom of the jaw when we add another loop in there. So let's add a loop. Even things out a bit. So here you can see that I've got a lot of nice detail packed into the corner of his mouth. And what this is going to let me do is get that nice deformation in there, but also get the types of wrinkles and crosswise stuff that he has going on in the corner of his mouth. And when he pulls back in this direction to smile, or even to sneer, it's going to retain a lot of detail in there. Additionally, when he opens his mouth, that area will be able to stretch a lot because there's a lot more detail packed into this small area. Similarly to how I put a lot of detail into the crotch area of the werewolf from last week, I'm putting a lot of detail into the corner of his mouth so that this can move around a lot, because this is one of the areas that will move around the most. Alright, so let's have this extend back like that. And we're going to want to capture the detail on the bottom of his chin right here. We also want to get the curvature of his jawline. And we don't really need loops going down all the way like that, because once you get back to this area it starts deforming less, and when you get down here it's deforming less. So really what we can do is we can cut through here to match these loops up here and connect to them, and then cut through here so that we can connect to the neck and the jawline. So let's see here. Actually, yeah, we will continue a little bit of these loops going up there, just in case we need some more detail. And then add detail in this area. That should work nicely. And if we have a 5-sided pole, like you see right here, as long as it's pushed back pretty far on the face, it's not going to be in the middle of an area that deforms a lot, and it's not going to present any smoothing or sculpting issues. Let's just connect these real quick, just to make sure we have nice continuous loops. Here we go, that's going to be pretty good. But we do have this one, which might present some problems, so how do we want to do this? How about extends down like this and add some more detail to the eye. If we add detail to the eye in this area, what it's going to do is it's going to add detail along this entire loop right here. So if we do that, it's going to be a better situation for everything, because it'll allow us to push some of this detail down into the cheek, and this area of the cheek tends to deform a bit, so it's going to be nice to have more detail there. We got one more loop going along there to match this guy. And then the loops going back here will connect to the ear. Yeah, there we go. Nice. So now we can start building the jawline and the neck. So let's start doing those. Here's bottom of his chin, bottom of his jaw. Move this into where you can see those creases. Center that. Now you can see that he has a little bit of a double chin right here. We'll add a loop in there to support that shape. And that'll also allow us to connect to this area up here a little more easily. So we can do it this way, pull back, even this out, because these are long, thin rectangles. We can actually smooth things out by pulling some of this back here. Like here. You know what? We'll just extrude that entire loop back like this. Now, let's come down his neck. Start building the shapes of the tendons. Oops. And the Adam's apple. And start extending around the back so that we can connect to these polygons up here. We can connect that. Smooth this area out a little. We can have this come down around the bottom. We'll clearly want something to connect to this. Oops. So I have a loop right there. This can come up and form the basis not only for the loop around the ear, but for the loop going around the back of the neck and the head. Oops. We'll want to connect these two. So we just do that. And then we want 1, 2, 3. So we'll just add 3 through here. Or rather 2 more to match. There we go. So now that I have what is sort of ramping up to be a nearly complete head model, does anybody who's watching have any questions or anything they might want to talk about on the chat? Otherwise, for the next, say, 45 minutes, I'm just going to continue modeling this, occasionally providing commentary if it seems necessary, and maybe start working on the ear a little bit, or start doing things like adding a little more detail in areas like this, you know, rounding out the neck, that type of thing. Yeah, if you're watching and you have any questions, feel free to type them into the Twitch chat, and I'll do my best to answer them. So there's 5 polygons right there, and I'm going to need to be able to connect to at least 4 of them because I can go around like this. So let's see here. 1, 2, 3. It's not quite enough detail back there. So let's move some stuff around a little bit. And a loop in there. Now, we've got some pretty sparse polygons here on the back of the head. That's not going to matter too much because the back of the head is usually not an area that should be deforming. If it is deforming, whoever has that head is probably not in a good way and should see a doctor. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, that should do it. Okay. Extrude outward. Extrude outward. So I've got a couple more questions in chat. One of which is what is this actually being created for? Not sure if you heard my spiel right at the beginning of this stream, but it bears repeating, I suppose, just for informational purposes. So what I'm doing this right now, what I'm doing this for right now, is essentially just instructional purposes. I like educating people and making sure that hopefully people I work with in the future have good basis for what they're working on. So I'm providing some information on the methods that I use for retopologizing models. And it's a month-long workshop in which I do these 2-hour streams on Twitch, and then for an additional hour after that I hop into a private hangout and talk with people who signed up. And during that discussion period, it's sort of a group discussion period, and we all contribute. But a lot of it revolves around either getting feedback or getting more information about the things that I specifically did in the stream, and talking about those things, or talking about things like portfolios. What's the best thing to put in a portfolio? That type of idea. The private hangouts are a little more free-form than the modeling streams, and there's a lot of Q&A about getting into the industry, things that you should or should not have in a portfolio, best practices for things like modeling and texturing and rendering. So really, the only thing that I'm creating this for is instructional purposes. I'm not going to be using this model for anything aside from showing people how this stuff works, and that's about it. I will be providing this specific model to the people who signed up through the Patreon that I have signed up, which uses the same username that I use here on Twitch. It's just XCK3D on Patreon. And if you signed up, you get access to those private Google Hangouts along with all the models that I make over the course of this 4-week program, along with 2 hours of dedicated discussion time each week, along with being able to ask me questions through email or whatever if you need some portfolio help or something like that. So yeah, that's basically the gist of this entire thing. If you're interested, I still have slots open. I'm going to be having I'm going to be doing more workshops like this in the future. Probably the next one is going to be, or the next one is probably going to be focused on texturing models in various different styles and methods and such. And if you can't afford to sign up for the hangouts and private workshop stuff, there are other cheaper options or whatever if you want to, or you can just hang out here and watch the stream. Something else that I've got a question about in the chat is how often do you have to retopologize a human character at work? I assume not often, since studios usually have a rigged generic model that's used as the basis for all humanoid characters. Is that right? Yes and no. To a certain extent, yes, we do use a lot of generic models at work. The model that I'm creating right now is actually very, very similar to the one we use at work. right down to things like the head shape. There are a few differences, but in general, this is the topology layout that we found works pretty well. It also is very similar to the topology used for characters like the ones in Uncharted, because it works very well with things like the facial action coding system, which lets an actor do a bunch of facial expressions, and then they'll turn that into an automated solution for giving them expressions in a game. So yes, we do have stuff like this at work. However, there are lots of edge cases and such where you'll run into not being able to use the generic model that you have. Certainly, for some characters, we'll use the head and hands that we have, the head, hands, and body, rather, that we have as a base, but then we'll do lots of sculpting and retopo on top of it. And for things like, say, a character's wearing gloves, if a character needs gloves on that have, loose bits around the wrist or something, that's not something that you can get from a generic hand model, so that's something you'll have to model. So a lot of the work that I and my coworkers do is mostly centered around either creating clothing or outfits. If there was like some sort of giant robot monster, that's not something we could use, and there is not a giant robot monster in Spider-Man. Just to clear that up, there are no giant robot monsters. But if there was something like that, that's not something we could use a generic model for. So that's something we would have to model on our own as well. For other areas, like clothing, those are entirely retopologized from bases that we make in Marvelous Designer and other programs. And those, in some cases, we can use some generic geometry for things like sleeves or very, very basic jackets and shirts. But in other cases, it's just simply not feasible because each piece of clothing is going to be fairly different to add variety or make sure that it works with a specific character. So a lot of retopology that goes on, sure, is sort of negated by having generic models like the one that I'm working on right now. But there is much, much more work to do, especially if you're doing things like, a variant of Spider-Man, or, maybe there is a thug who, he gets shot or blown up or something like that, and there needs to be a version of that model specifically for that. So those are areas where we will go and create individual, unique models. However, most of the human heads that we use, most if not all actually, use the same topology and are reprojected onto different bases that come from 3D scans. So another question I've got is, with the body last week, the one where I made the werewolf character, I worked in multiples of 4, 8, 16, etc. Am I no longer working towards that goal right now and just getting the base polyloops down, or will I be looking to make the head-to-body connections multiples of 4, 8, or 16? That's a very good question. Generally, I do work in multiples, 4, 8, 16, 32, etc. But in certain cases, especially with head topology, it's very difficult to work in those restrictive numbers for very long. Mainly because there are certain areas of the face where it makes more sense to have kind of odd numbers for the loops that you have. Now, what do I have around the base here? This is 13 polygons around the base. This is so if I double that, that's going to be 26 sides. Or I can't math right now, but yes, 26 sides. So let's just mirror this real quick. Whoops. So that we have a nice consistent thing to work with, and then talk about connecting a head to a body. Now I'm going to be talking about connecting heads to bodies a little bit on Thursday, and possibly bleeding into next week. But this is as good a time as any to start talking about it, at least, even if I'm not going to finish. Um, so for this case right here, I've got 26 edges around his neck. Basically, what that means for me right now is that if his body, say his shoulders right here have a neck hole that has, say, 32 sides, I'm running into some problems right now. I don't have enough geometry to connect this to his shoulders. Now, that can present some problems if I need this guy to be, say, shirtless. Like if I was modeling a bodybuilder or the Hulk or some other character where you're always going to see him shirtless or mostly shirtless. It's a problem to have mismatching numbers between the neck and the rest of the body. There are ways that you can hide it, but in general, you want things to flow very nicely into the rest of the body. There are some workarounds for it, though. For example, there are some areas on this head where I can really easily add some detail without having to worry about, messing with the silhouette or anything. Especially in areas like the back of the neck or the loops going down through the chin. Because the interior of the mouth, nobody's ever going to see it in any detail, it can have all sorts of weird geometry in there, so that, so that when you connect the top to the bottom, it might be pretty ugly in there in the high poly. But in this case, if I wanted to make it so that this guy has 32 sides for his neck, really all I need to do is come in here and add a few more loops. So I can just do this, and suddenly he's got 29 edges. Well, that's a pretty freaking weird number because I'm not doing this completely symmetrically, but let's do this nice and symmetrically. So, doot. Okay, he's got 30 edges. I just need to add 2 more edges, and I have a loop going all the way up and around his head, or rather right here. And if I slide this back, it'll give me more room. I can add another loop through there, and now he's got 32 edges. I can smooth this out by taking some of these edges from the back and pushing them a little forward, but really that's just tweaking at this point. Really what you need to be concerned with when you are trying to connect bodies to heads is making sure that you know where you have edges that terminate, or loops that terminate in easy to work with places. So in this case, I have this loop that just goes around the top of his head. Top of his head's not going to move around very much. Top of his head doesn't really need to have more or less detail, just simply because it's kind of an egg shape. Unless I'm going to be sculpting some sort of huge gash into the top of his head, I don't really need to worry about that area, so I can just add some more stuff that goes around the top of it. And I could even terminate some of this with triangles up there, and nobody would be the wiser simply because it's going to be covered up by his hair. So that is generally how I would add more detail to a model so that I can connect, say, the head to the neck. It can be kind of a weird, goofy process, but it's fairly easy to do as long as you keep track of loops like this. And this is why it's a good idea to start with pretty low resolution geometry and then work up to higher levels like you see right here. This right here is not very easily workable because it has so many polygons and so many loops, so it's easier to work on low res geometry and then go higher as you need that resolution. So there's another question here. Is it common for the head of a hero character to have as much resolution as the entire rest of its body, since the face needs more detailed animation? That's a good question. It's, yes and no, I suppose. It depends on the game that you're working on, the restrictions that you're under. A lot of the heads that we'll work on for, say, cutscenes might be higher or lower detail than what's in the final game, simply because of like the ability to do facial expressions on a lower detail model and then transfer those facial expressions over to the high detail version. Um, there's lots of different stuff you can do. For an in-game model, though, it would be kind of unusual, at least for what we're doing in Insomniac, and I can't really comment on other places like Naughty Dog or whatever, just simply because each of us uses very slightly different methods. But in general, from what I've seen, it would not make too much sense for the head to, or at least just the model of the head without any eyes or hair or teeth or anything like that, to have more detail than the rest of the body, because you do want fairly consistent detail across the entire body, and one of the best ways to get consistent detail is nice even texel density and stuff along those lines. However, in general, a lot of heads you see will still have lots of detail compared to the rest of the body, simply because, yes, we are focusing on the head. However, that detail disparity is not going to be huge. We still try to keep fairly even polygon density across a model, unless it's in a place where nobody's really going to be noticing if there's lower resolution there. So perhaps, say, the middle of the back might have a little less resolution than other areas, simply because the back of a character is not going to have as much strong movement, and people aren't going to be focusing on it as much unless it's a hero character that you're going to be seeing from the back. Like, for example, Nathan Drake. Nathan Drake has holsters, and he's got belts and other stuff that you see on his back a lot. You see him from behind a lot, so that's an area where you might focus more detail. But in general, the back, maybe other parts of the torso, the shins or thighs, those are areas where in general it's pretty okay to have less detail. But comparing the head to the rest of the body, it's generally a good idea to have fairly even sizes of polygons, so that it's easier to work with in general. If you have evenly laid out polygons, it's a little easier to rig. It's a little easier to work with the UVs on the model, and it's also much easier to get consistent shading, because small polygons, lots of small polygons next to each other, will shade very differently from a few big polygons next to each other. There are large disparities between, say, the shading that a single plane gets in a game engine and what an entire face gets, or a subdivided plane with just a little bit of bend to it. Those are things that will shade drastically differently, so you'll want to have that density fairly even. Which version of Modo am I using? Is it the indie or the full version? Just to know if the indie has the retopology tools. I believe the indie version of Modo does have retopology tools. I'm not sure how full-featured they are compared to the full version of Modo. Right now I'm using an older version of Modo. It's 901, just simply because I haven't seen fit to upgrade, at home at least, since then. The newer versions of Modo have some pretty cool features, but nothing really earth-shattering that I've seen the need to upgrade for. And most of the tools in 902, I'm using 902, most of the tools in 902 work pretty well, so I don't really have, there isn't a necessity for me to upgrade right now. I could just as easily be using an earlier or later version of Modo. There are just some things that I like that I upgraded specifically to 902 for, or the 9 series, like UV tools and stuff like that. And you could do most of the stuff that I am doing right now in programs like Topogun or Maya or Max. Basically any program out there that does 3D these days is going to have some form of retopology tools. Each one will look different. Each one will perform very slightly differently, but in general, it's the same tool set that you see across different platforms. I've heard, I mentioned last week, and I'll mention again, I've heard very good things about the retopology tools in Blender. I've heard good things about other retopology tools out there as well. So, find the thing that works for you, because the program is not the thing that's going to provide good results. It's what you can do with the program. So if you're very good at a program, you're going to get good results as long as you know what you're doing. Just move this over so that we can get some more detail along here and here. We're going to add some more loops here. That's going to cut across the back of his head, rounding that out. And then this one is going to go down his neck. So actually what I can do is I can move this over. Let's just, okay, that didn't work. Let's move that over like this. Here we go. Oops. Add a loop in here. Like that. And I will add another loop through here. We can smooth some of this stuff out, make it follow the contours of his eyelids a little better. Here we go. Alrighty. Will I model the inside of the mouth for this character? For this guy, not right now. I'm not going to really bother with the inside of the mouth, at least not too extensively. But that's something that I could do pretty easily. In fact, I can make a basic mouth sock right now, just by extruding this out into his mouth. Let's just make it nice and even in there, just flat along the z-axis. And I can, since I'm using pretty consistent loops, I can just add these to his lips right here. They'll just kind of stick on there. The main reason that I wasn't planning on getting into the inside of his mouth is because really there's not a lot there. The inside of the mouth often has separate models for the teeth and gums. For a number of reasons. One, it's just easier to model them as separate pieces. Two, it's easier to rig them as separate pieces because really they only have to have rigid deformation. You're never going to see somebody's teeth and gums moving around in the same way that their lips would, because it's all just bone. There's very little soft tissue inside the mouth aside from the inside of the cheeks and the tongue. And you're not going to be seeing the inside of the cheeks very much because it's so dark inside the mouth. And when you see the tongue, it's going to be a separate piece as well, so you just don't really need to worry about connecting it to the, or it's going to be a separate piece because you're never going to see the back end of it, so you don't really need to worry about connecting it to the rest of the mouth. But let's take a look here. So if I go, I can just smooth this out and then make it a little larger. Oopsie, let's turn off symmetry. Here we go. So this right here is going to be, almost good enough for the inside of this guy's mouth. Now, if we take a look at the base model, let's turn that off. If we just look inside here, let's hide everything from the neck down. If we look inside here, you can actually see that he has an inside of a mouth, and you'll see that it doesn't have super clean topology. There's actually, right here, this used to be just one big ingon, and that's because nobody's actually going to be seeing there because it's going to be hidden by the teeth and gums and other stuff so much. So It doesn't have to be very clean, it just has to be a big open shape. And unless you're going to be shining a light back in there to look at his uvula or down his throat or something, nobody's going to care. So, if I go in here, I can cap this off, and then let's just add a quick bevel to that just so that it reinforces the shape. Resize it, and then we can add some loops to just resize this so there's enough there's enough space for the mouth sock and the teeth and gums, and there we go. That should be good enough. Now, obviously this is not going to be great for sculpting or anything, and if you bring this into something like ZBrush to start sculpting, it's going to complain that you have a big old ingon back there. And really what you can do in this case is just turn it into a spike or something. And nobody will be the wiser, because nobody is ever going to see the back of his throat. And if they are, then it's a special weird use case, and you would specifically model that out. Now, we want some more detail in his lips to capture this curvature, so let's just add a couple more loops here. There we go. Let's add some more detail along here as well. This is going to be nice for talking. Well, maybe that's a little too much, a little too dense compared to the rest. We can just slide that out. There we go. So now what's going to happen is when this gets subdivided, oops, let's turn on symmetry and move these. When this gets subdivided, and we have this unhidden, this gets subdivided, it's going to conform to this shape really nicely. If we come back here, nice and smooth. Let's just do this. There we go. It's looking pretty good, and you can actually see that just with this fairly small amount of geometry, it's conforming nicely to these kind of poochy bits around the corners of his mouth. You can see that he's got the philtrum right there. So this will be appropriate for either animating in a game or sculpting as a high poly in ZBrush. Alrighty. So now we have that. I'll lay down just a simple base for the ear. I'm not going to get too into the ear right now. But one thing I am going to do is I'm going to make sure that I have a loop that lets me connect the eye across the cheekbone to this area right here. So I'm going to add another loop. Oops. Right in here. Oops. There we go. Let's move this around. This is going to connect right down there. We're going to add a loop in here. And alrighty. Probably going to want this to be a little bit curved at the top. We're probably going to need more detail along the back here to connect the back of the ear, but we'll not worry about that too much for now. We do need a simple base for the inside of the ear. Let's just hide everything else. Lay down a simple base shape for the inside here. Okay. Let's extrude that so that comes up to this area. I've got another question, which is, are modelers or riggers usually in charge of facial blend shapes for games? It sort of depends, and it depends on the methods that you're using, as well as whether or not you're working at a large or small company, or if you're working with third-party vendors. For a lot of companies, they'll use third-party vendors or sort of what's often called insourcing, which basically just means that a different division of the company handles different parts of making characters. So for a lot of Sony games, especially ones like the Uncharted series, you'll actually have the individual studios like Naughty Dog shipping out their facial capture and blend shapes to internal companies like internal Sony companies that specifically handle things like blend shapes, facial animation, motion capture, etc. It really depends on how things work out at the specific company. In the case of Insomniac, we work with some third-party vendors who help us do a lot of motion capture and animation and stuff. But they're mostly just in charge of the basic setup, and then we take a lot of that information and push it farther. The third-party vendors that we generally work with will provide us with blend shapes that we are then able to push farther by either just adjusting the rigs or making very small tweaks to the shapes. In some cases, like for very unimportant characters, it might just be something in-house that they'll give to a modeler or rigger, just depending upon who's available. For something like a super basic civilian character, maybe, you might not even have a lot of facial blend shapes. You might just have one or two basic ones that can be shared across multiple characters. So that would just be maybe an afternoon or two of work for maybe one person, just depending upon what their availability is. Usually the riggers will have final say in whether something is working or not. So that's something to keep in mind, because they're going to be the ones who are working with it, working with that information, the facial blend shapes and such the most. So it will largely that type of thing will largely depend on just who is, I guess, in charge of animation, in charge of animating those characters and rigging those characters what they want to do, because the sort of onus really is on the rigger to make sure that he or she gets the tools and software that they need, or rather the blend shapes and such they need, and then they'll provide that to animators and such. Or at least in my experience. It might be different at other companies, but in general it seems that working with third-party people leads to a lot more flexibility with who's doing the blend shapes, if there are any done in-house. So right now I'm laying out just some really basic topology for an ear, and all I'm trying to do is get the general shapes, because I'm actually going to be pretty heavily relying on subdivision and the retopology tools to capture a lot of this detail that you see in here, mainly because I just don't want to have to worry about it, and because ears just don't move around that much. They do move in certain expressions, along with some slight sliding of the scalp, but in general what you'll see on most game characters is that the ears don't have a ton of detail simply because they don't need it. Very few people are going to be looking at the ears, so you should just get the basic shape in there and then worry about it later. This is definitely one of those areas where the topology that you use can be a lot more forgiving. And as long as it does not conflict with anything around it, it should be fine. So in this case, I'm going to be connecting this to here, that to there. Let's just close this off. This can connect right here. We can push that. And then if we do this, get a nice big square shape in here. Push that up to there. Close that off. So we're approaching the last few minutes of the public portion of this stream. It's 8:52 p.m. right now. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to be moving to the private hangout to have a discussion with the people who signed up through Patreon. If that's something that sounds appealing, if you want to get portfolio reviews, if you want to talk about stuff that happened on the stream with other people, if you want access to the models that I'm working on for this stuff, check out my Patreon. It's just go to Patreon and look up my username. It's the same as on here, XCK3D, and check it out. Sign up if you want to. If it's a little too expensive, or if you want to just watch the captures of these live streams and the private hangout sessions, that's an option too. I've got a little payment option on there if you just want to get that stuff early. I do post the recordings of these streams on YouTube, but they don't go public for a few days, and only the people who have either signed up for the program or signed up to just watch the videos will get access as soon as they're uploaded. Which reminds me, I need to make public the stream from last week, or the second stream from last week. That'll be on my YouTube page, and I'll be posting links to that on Twitter and such. So yeah, if you have any more questions in these next few minutes, we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left in the stream before I close things off. So fire away, and if there's nothing else, you guys have a good night, and I'll see you on Thursday. So I've got another question. It's, do I ever do one-on-one mentorships? Currently, no. I'm not doing any one-on-one stuff. I like to focus mainly on sort of group learning type formats because I find that works very well for feedback. There are often times where I will just simply miss something in a feedback session, and it's nice to have other people there to give feedback on my feedback. It's useful for me to sort of hear what people have to say about what I have to say. So I haven't been doing any, I haven't been doing any one-on-one stuff for that simple reason. If I did do one-on-one mentorships, it would end up probably being a little bit expensive because it's much more time consuming to work one-on-one with someone. But if it's something that a lot of people seem interested in, I might open the door to that later on. Though right now I just want to focus on sort of getting as wide an audience as possible so that as many people as possible can, benefit from anything I might be able to teach. If I get a lot of feedback, yeah, I'll start looking into one-on-one stuff. But for now, I'm mostly interested in doing group things so that I can have a lot of people in the discussion. And it's also nice to stream this stuff publicly because I get a lot of questions that I might not get from a small group who's just watching a private lesson. So that's something else that I find valuable. So short answer, no. Long answer, I guess what I just said. All right, so we're approaching the last minute or so of this stream. So I wanted to thank everybody who dropped by. I know a lot of people tend to filter in and out, and that's okay. I do record all of these streams, and I will be putting them up on YouTube over the next few weeks. If you are interested in seeing the streams as soon as they're available, I have options for that on my Patreon, and I mentioned that before. If you if you want to check out the mentorship, or rather the private workshop stuff that I have, once again, check out the Patreon, see what it says, and if it sounds appealing, go ahead and sign up. If it's a little too much, there's options for just paying for videos or just kicking me a couple bucks if that seems like a cool thing to do. But really, I'm just doing this for general education purposes. So, yeah, thanks for coming. Thanks for watching. I'm always happy to answer questions in the chat or on Twitter or Facebook or wherever you know me from. And if you just happen to stumble across this stream, I hope it was interesting or enjoyable or you got something out of it. And I will see you guys on Thursday. On Thursday, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the topology of this head, and I'm also going to be conforming this model to this sculpt. I'm going to be taking the topology that I have for this guy. I'm going to be doing some quick UVs on it just to show some examples. I'll be getting more into UVs later on in this this workshop, and then I'll be projecting that onto this model just in ZBrush. I'm not going to use any specialized tools or anything, just to keep it pretty accessible. And I'm going to talk about where you would want to, areas you might want to worry about or focus on when you're projecting generic topology like that. So yeah, if that sounds good, tune in on Thursday, same time, 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'm going to be going for a couple hours and then hopping into the private chat just like tonight. So hopefully this was helpful, and if I don't see you, have a good one. Have a good night, guys. Bye.